Chapter 7, Black Widow. Nancy raced upstairs 2 steps at a time. Susan was in her bed, cowering under the covers. Thank goodness she's all right, Nancy thought, and sped on to the attic. Who's up there? She called. Me, Effie! Nancy doubled her steps. She found the maid alone, jumping about. She was waving her left hand in the air and wailing pitifully. I've been bit! I've been bit! She screamed. What bit you? Nancy demanded. The skeleton! Do something quick! Effie, be sensible. What was it that bit you? It was that skeleton, I tell you! Dramatically, the maid pointed to the bony figure which leaned forward at a rakish angle from the open door of the wardrobe closet. He just reached out and bit my finger! Oh, the thing is alive! Nancy examined Effie's finger, but in the dim light could see no evidence of a wound. She wondered if the girl's imagination had been playing tricks on her. Nancy heard footsteps on the stairway and called down. Don't bother to come up, Mr. March. Everything is all right, I guess. Except me, Effie wailed. Let's go downstairs, Nancy said to the maid. I'll check your finger again. By the way, what were you looking for in the wardrobe? Some clean linen to change the beds. There's hardly any in the house. Oh, my whole arm hurts now. When they reached the second floor, Nancy examined the maid's hand. She received a distinct shock, and Effie herself began to sob loudly. Look at it! I'm going to die! She cried. This remark brought Susan to the hall. She and her grandfather gazed in awe at Effie's swollen forearm and the tiny puncture in her index finger. What did that? The child asked in fright. Nancy did not reply to the question. Instead, she gently told Susan to get back into bed. Quickly, she asked Mr. March for a large handkerchief and tied it tightly about Effie's upper arm. We'd better take her to a doctor, she said. There isn't anything here with which to take care of this wound. To Mr. March, she whispered, I'm afraid a poisonous spider bit Effie. Nancy drove speedily to the office of Dr. Ivers. Fortunately, he was in. He confirmed Nancy's diagnosis, adding that the spider probably was a black widow. One rarely finds them in this part of the country, he said, getting a hypodermic needle and filling it with an antidote. By now, Effie looked and acted quite ill. The physician patted her shoulder and tried to keep the girl's mind off herself. He said, There's another dangerous spider, the tarantula, but that isn't native to these parts either. Effie began to moan, saying she knew her young life was over. Nonsense, said Dr. Ivers. Fortunately, Miss Drew put the tourniquet on, and you won't suffer as much as you might have otherwise. You'd better keep quiet for a couple of days, though. How am I going to do my work? Effie asked. Don't worry about that, Nancy spoke up quickly. I'll help you. The doctor gave Nancy instructions for taking care of Effie and told the patient not to be alarmed. He also advised that the old house be searched thoroughly for the Black Widow spider. I believe I'll go home and get Mrs. Gruen, Nancy told Effie as they drove off. She can come out for a few hours to help us. The Drews' housekeeper was glad to be of assistance. As soon as they reached the March home, she and Nancy went immediately to the attic, carrying an insecticide spray gun and a broom. There they brushed down dozens of webs and caught every spider they could locate. We found none except the common house variety, Nancy sighed. Where could the Black Widow have crawled to? I'm not going to let you stay here unless we find it, Hannah Gruen said firmly. Nancy tried to dispel the woman's fears by saying, Effie must have scared him off. But she was worried. Perhaps an intruder had left the deadly spider there as a warning. The most likely person was the one who had stolen Phip March's original music. Was he Ben Banks? I must write to the publisher of Song of the Wind at once for the address of Ben Banks, Nancy determined. In all the excitement, I completely forgot him. Oh! Hannah Gruen said suddenly. Crack! Her broom came down with a whack on a spider which had just crawled from beneath the wardrobe. Nancy used the spray gun. It's the Black Widow! Nancy cried jubilantly. Now you'll have nothing to worry about. Unless there are more of these poisonous creatures up here, declared Mrs. Gruen. She agreed, however, that it probably would be safe for Nancy to stay, but cautioned her to be extra careful. While the housekeeper prepared supper, Nancy hurriedly wrote a note to the publisher of Song of the Wind. Then she went to make Effie comfortable. The maid was feverish and declared her arm itched dreadfully. When she finally dropped off to sleep, Nancy tiptoed away to see that Susan was all right. The little girl looked up and said, A bad spider bit Effie. She told me all about it. Nancy was provoked to learn the maid had told the story to Susan, but she merely smiled. That's right, Susan, but only good spiders live around here. The bad one is dead now. To get the child's mind off the unfortunate subject, she told her about the funny antics of the jumping spiders and the flying variety. Some of them are just like trapeze performers in a circus, Nancy explained. They spin a thread and then let the wind carry them through the air. Sometimes they go all the way from shore to a ship at sea. Oh, that kind of spider would be lots of fun to watch, Susan remarked, her fears gone now. Hannah Gruen brought up a tray of food for the little girl. Nancy decided that while Susan was eating supper, Mr. March might sit with her, and she would drive Hannah home. When they reached the Drew house, Bess and George were just leaving. Where in the world have you been, Nancy? George remonstrated. We thought something had happened to you. How about having dinner at my house and telling us about your new mystery? Nancy thanked her, but explained why she could not accept the invitation. Bess exclaimed in horror when she heard about the Black Widow episode. You'd better stay out of that place, she advised. I'll be careful, don't worry, Nancy replied. She told the girls to climb into her car and she would drop them off. Nancy left her friends at George's house and went on. After stopping to buy a flashlight battery, she drove to the March estate and was in time to tuck Susan into bed. The little girl looked up at her wistfully. I wish you'd always stay with me, she confided. You're my best friend. Nancy leaned down and kissed her. I'm going to be here for a while, she promised. Suppose we pretend each day is a year. Susan liked this game, and soon she went to sleep happily. Nancy joined Mr. March on the first floor, where he was listening to the radio. As they ate supper together, he told her more about his family. I guess my son Phip came by his musical ability naturally, Mr. March said. My mother wrote songs for the sheer joy of it. They were composed only for the family, though, and never got beyond manuscript form. My son used parts of the melodies in his work. The piece called Song of the Wind was based in part on one that my mother wrote years ago. Nancy pounced eagerly on this bit of information. It might prove to be good evidence in case of a lawsuit. What became of your mother's old songs? She asked quickly. I couldn't say. A few of the pieces may have been put away in the attic. I'm sure Phip didn't have them. The old melodies had been hummed to him so many times, he knew them by heart. The clue was sufficient to start Nancy on another intensive search. As soon as she washed the dishes, Nancy put the new battery in her flashlight and went to the attic. She began poking around in boxes. One of these was filled with interesting newspapers, some of which dated back 100 years. "I'm reading more than I'm working," the young detective scolded herself with a laugh. "I'd better get on with the hunt." Going hurriedly through the remaining papers, Nancy came at last to the bottom of the box. Her gaze fastened upon a ribbon-tied roll of parchment. "This may be the very thing I'm after," she thought excitedly. Unwrapping it, she discovered the sheet contained the music and words of a song. She hummed the first few bars. They were not familiar. She started to investigate another box which stood nearby. As Nancy eagerly plunged her hand down, something sharp buried itself in her finger. With a sinking heart, Nancy wondered if she might have been poisoned the way Effie had been. Gingerly, she pushed aside the papers, looking for a black widow spider. Then Nancy laughed as she saw what had pricked her finger. Men's antique shoe buckles. "What gorgeous ones," she thought, lifting out several pairs of the old silver ornaments. They were studded with semi-precious stones, one of which had a sharp prong on it. Nancy was happy over the find. The buckles would bring a nice sum of money for Mr. March. After wrapping them carefully in the paper, she put the buckles in her pocket. At that instant, the flashlight which Nancy had laid on the floor rolled away and clicked off. As she leaned forward to pick it up, something landed with a soft thud against her hand. Out of nowhere floated a few eerie notes of music, like the faint strumming of a harp. End of Chapter 7.